On the day we read my husband's will, my daughter-in-law showed up wearing a t-shirt that said, "Taking what the greedy old hag always kept from me." I stayed silent. My son laughed until he cried whenever he looked at her shirt. But when the lawyer mentioned her name in the will, that laughter died in his throat. I should have known Brittany would find a way to make Harold's funeral about herself.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
She had perfected that skill over the 8 years she'd been married to my son Derek. But even I wasn't prepared for the sight of her walking into Hartman & Associates law firm wearing that horrible shirt, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the grief she claimed to be feeling. Derek saw my face when she walked in and actually chuckled. "Oh, come on, Mom. Brittany's just trying to lighten the mood." Dad would have laughed at that. Would he? I wondered, staring at the words printed across my daughter-in-law's chest in bold black letters. The Harold I'd been married to for 45 years might have been many things, but he wasn't cruel. He wouldn't have found humor in his wife being called a greedy old hag at his own funeral proceedings. "It's just Brittany being Brittany," Derek continued, settling into the leather chair beside his wife. At 42, my son still had the same easy smile he'd worn as a child, but something had changed in his eyes over the years. Something that made him see cruelty as comedy, disrespect as humor. I remained silent, clutching my black purse in my lap. 3 days earlier, I had buried the love of my life. 3 days of casseroles from neighbors, meaningless condolences, and watching Derek and Brittany discuss Harold's estate like vultures circling a carcass. I was exhausted, heartbroken, and in no mood for whatever game Brittany was playing. Mr. Hartman cleared his throat from behind his mahogany desk, his weathered hands shuffling through documents. He'd been Harold's lawyer for over 20 years, had drawn up our wills, handled the purchase of our home, guided us through every major legal decision of our married life. Today, his usual warm demeanor seemed strained. "Before we begin," he said, his eyes meeting mine briefly, "I want you to know that Harold came to see me 6 months ago to make some final amendments to his will. He was very specific about his intentions." Brittany leaned forward, her shirt stretching tight across her chest, making those awful words even more visible. "What kind of amendments?" Her voice carried that edge it always did when money was involved, sharp and eager. I thought about the last 6 months of Harold's life. He'd grown quieter, more thoughtful. I'd attributed it to his declining health, the way cancer had slowly stolen his strength. But maybe it had been something else. Maybe he'd been watching, observing, planning. "He added several specific bequests," Mr. Hartman continued, opening the manila folder. "Some quite unusual." Derek squeezed Brittany's hand. "Well, Dad always was full of surprises. Remember when he bought that motorcycle at 70? Another laugh, another attempt to lighten a moment that felt increasingly heavy. I remembered that motorcycle. Harold had bought it after Brittany made one of her cutting remarks about old people who refused to accept their limitations. He'd ridden it exactly twice before selling it, but I'd understood the message. Harold might have been aging, but he wasn't ready to be dismissed. "Shall we proceed?" Mr. Hartman asked, though it wasn't really a question. As he began reading Harold's will, I let my mind drift back to the beginning, to when Derek first brought Brittany home 8 years ago. She'd been charming then, full of compliments about my cooking, my house, my youthful appearance. She'd called Harold Dad from the very first dinner, had insisted on helping with dishes, had seemed genuinely interested in our family stories. I should have seen through it. Harold had been more skeptical from the start, making comments about how she seemed to be performing rather than simply being herself. But I'd wanted Derek to be happy. After his difficult divorce from his first wife, seeing him smile again had been worth ignoring my instincts. The manipulation had been gradual, so subtle I'd barely noticed it happening. First, Brittany had suggested that family dinners might be too much work for me. Then she'd started hosting holidays at their house instead, claiming she wanted to give me a break. Slowly, I'd found myself more and more excluded from my own son's life, relegated to brief phone calls and occasional visits that always felt rushed, interrupted, unwelcome. "To my beloved wife Maria, Mr. Hartman's voice brought me back to the present. "I leave our home and all its contents, along with the majority of my financial assets, totaling approximately $2 million. I heard Brittany's sharp intake of breath, saw Derek's jaw tighten slightly. I knew they'd expected more, had probably already spent Harold's money in their minds. But this was just the beginning. To my son Derek, the lawyer continued, I leave the amount of $50,000 with the condition that this inheritance be kept separate from any marital assets. 50,000? Brittany's voice rose an octave. That's it? Mr. Hartman held up a hand. There's more. Harold was very specific about additional bequests. He turned a page, and I saw something flicker in his expression. To Brittany Morrison, I leave the following items. The room went completely still. Even Derek stopped shifting in his chair. Brittany's face had gone pale, making her carefully applied makeup look garish against her skin. $1, Mr. Hartman read slowly, and my sincere hope that this amount, combined with what she has already taken from this family through manipulation and calculated cruelty, will be sufficient for her future endeavors. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's mouth hung open, his eyes moving between the lawyer and his wife. Brittany's hands were shaking, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the arms of her chair. There's more, Mr. Hartman said quietly. Harold included a letter. My heart began to pound. Harold had never mentioned a letter to me. What had he seen that I'd been too hurt, too tired, too accommodating to confront? As Mr. Hartman opened the sealed envelope, I caught sight of Harold's familiar handwriting on cream-colored paper. Even from across the desk, I could see it was lengthy, several pages covered in his careful script. Should I read this aloud, or would you prefer to read it privately? The lawyer asked, looking directly at me. I glanced at Derek, who still looked stunned, then at Brittany, whose face had now flushed red with either embarrassment or rage. The shirt she wore suddenly seemed less like a joke and more like evidence of exactly who she really was. Read it aloud, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Harold clearly wanted it to be heard. Mr. Hartman nodded and began to read in Harold's words. Words that would change everything I thought I knew about my husband's final months, and everything Derek thought he knew about his wife. Mr. Hartman adjusted his reading glasses and began Harold's letter in a voice that seemed to carry my husband's gentle but determined tone. My dearest Maria, if you are hearing this letter, it means I am gone, and you are sitting in that law office wondering how our family fell apart so completely. I want you to know that I saw everything. Every cruel comment disguised as concern. Every manipulation presented as love. Every moment Britney systematically erased you from our son's life, while I was too weak to stop it effectively. I felt tears prick my eyes. Harold had known. All those times I'd felt invisible, dismissed, unwelcome in my own son's life. Harold had been watching and understanding what I couldn't bring myself to admit. I began documenting Brittany's behavior 3 years ago, when she convinced Derek to cancel your birthday dinner because I was too sick to celebrate. I wasn't too sick, Maria. I specifically asked Derek that morning if we were still having your party, and he said Brittany thought it would be too much stress for me. When I insisted we could manage something small, he said Brittany had already made other plans for that evening. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I remembered that birthday. I'd spent the entire day preparing Derek's favorite foods, expecting our usual family celebration. Instead, I'd received a phone call at 5 o'clock with Derek's apologies and vague excuses about Harold's health. I'd eaten cake alone that night, telling myself they were just being considerate. The next incident was Thanksgiving 2 years ago, Mr. Hartman continued reading. Brittany hosted dinner and seated you at the children's table, claiming the adults' table was too crowded. When you offered to help in the kitchen, she told you to just relax and let the younger generation handle things. And I watched Derek nod along, completely oblivious to how his wife was treating his mother like an unwelcome burden. Brittany's face had gone from red to pale to red again. She kept glancing at Derek, who was staring at the floor, his previous amusement completely gone. But the moment I knew I had to take action was last Christmas morning, the letter continued. Maria, you brought those beautiful hand-knitted sweaters for Derek and Brittany, remember? You'd spent months working on them. Brittany opened hers, smiled that plastic smile and said, How thoughtful, Maria. These will be perfect for donation. She actually laughed when she said it, and Derek laughed too, like your months of work were just a quaint joke from the old lady. I did remember. I'd chosen the softest wool, spent hours perfecting the intricate cable pattern I knew Brittany admired in store displays. When she mentioned donating it, Derek had chuckled and said something about me living in the past, when people preferred modern things. I'd smiled and agreed, then gone home and cried for an hour. From that day forward, I paid attention to everything. I started writing down dates, conversations, incidents. I wanted to document exactly how methodically Brittany was isolating you, Maria, and how successfully she was turning our son into someone we barely recognize. Derek finally looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Dad was taking notes about our family dinners? Mr. Hartman paused in his reading. There are several pages of documentation here, Derek. Very detailed observations. I don't want to hear anymore, Brittany said suddenly, standing up. This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding. Harold was sick, maybe confused about things. Sit down, Derek said quietly, but his voice carried a steel I hadn't heard in years. Let him finish. Brittany remained standing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The shirt she wore suddenly seemed prophetic, rather than mocking. She was about to learn exactly what the greedy old hag had supposedly kept from her. I need you all to understand, Mr. Hartman continued with Harold's words, that I changed my will not out of spite, but out of love. Love for Maria, who deserves better than to spend her remaining years being dismissed and diminished by people who should cherish her. And love for Derek, who I hope might still remember the man his mother and I raised him to be. Derek's hands were shaking now. What else does it say? Harold documented specific incidents over a 2-year period, Mr. Hartman explained, flipping to another page. May 15th last year, Derek's promotion celebration dinner. Brittany insisted on a restaurant she knew Maria disliked, then spent the evening discussing vacation plans to places she knew Maria couldn't afford to join them. When Maria tried to contribute to the conversation, Brittany would change the subject or check her phone. I remembered that dinner. I'd felt so excluded, so aware that I didn't belong in their world of expensive restaurants and exotic travel plans. I'd made excuses and left early, claiming tiredness. July 4th, family barbecue at Derek and Brittany's house. Brittany assigned Maria to keep an eye on the paper plates while everyone else socialized. When Maria tried to help with the grilling, Derek told her to let Brittany handle it because she knew what she was doing. Maria spent most of the afternoon sitting alone on the porch. The memories came flooding back, each one more painful than the last. I'd told myself I was being sensitive, that maybe I was too old to understand their generation's way of doing things. But Harold had seen it all for what it really was. September 10th, Derek's birthday. Maria brought the chocolate cake she's made for his birthday every year since he was 5. Brittany had ordered a professional cake from the bakery, claiming she didn't want Maria to go to all that trouble. Maria's cake sat untouched while everyone praised Brittany's store-bought dessert. Derek didn't even taste the cake his mother had made. Derek's face had gone completely white. I could see him remembering that day, probably for the first time seeing it through different eyes. The hurt in my expression when he'd raved about Brittany's cake while mine sat ignored on the kitchen counter. But the final entry, Mr. Hartman said, was written just 1 week before Harold's death. Brittany sat back down heavily, as if her legs could no longer support her. She'd stopped trying to maintain her composure, and I could see something like panic beginning to creep into her eyes. March 18th. Maria came to help me with my medications while Derek was at work. Brittany arrived unexpectedly and found Maria organizing my pill bottles. Instead of thanking her, Brittany said, "Maria, you really shouldn't be handling Harold's medications. What if you mix something up? Maybe it's better if I take care of this from now on." She was trying to cut Maria off from even caring for her own husband in his final weeks. I remembered that day perfectly. I'd been helping Harold with his increasingly complex medication schedule, something I'd done throughout his illness. Brittany's suggestion that I was too incompetent to handle it had stung deeply, especially when Derek had agreed that maybe it would be safer if Brittany managed everything. That night, Harold's letter continued, I called Mr. Hartman and made the final changes to my will. I realized that Brittany wasn't just thoughtless or inconsiderate. She was deliberately and systematically erasing Maria from our family, and she was succeeding. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Mr. Hartman's old grandfather clock. Derek was staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Brittany looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor, but Harold wasn't finished. Mr. Hartman turned to the final page, and I could see there was still more to read. More truths that would finally expose exactly what kind of woman my son had married, and exactly what kind of man he had allowed himself to become. Mr. Hartman cleared his throat before reading the final page of Harold's letter. I could sense this was the part my husband had struggled most to write, the words that would finally shatter any remaining illusions about the woman our son had married. There is one more thing I must tell you, and this is the hardest part to write. Last Tuesday, exactly 5 days before my death, I was resting in the living room when Brittany came to visit. She thought I was sleeping, but I heard every word of her phone conversation in the kitchen. Derek leaned forward, his jaw tight. What phone conversation? She was talking to someone about my funeral arrangements. Mr. Hartman continued reading Harold's words. Not the logistics, Maria, but about what she planned to wear. She said, and I quote, "I've already picked out the perfect shirt for the old bat's funeral. It says exactly what I think about her finally being out of our lives." The blood drained from my face. Brittany had planned this cruelty before Harold was even gone. She'd been shopping for that horrible shirt while my husband was dying in the next room. The person on the phone must have asked what the shirt said, because Brittany laughed and said, "Taking what the greedy old hag always kept from me." Perfect, right? She spent 45 years hoarding Harold's attention and Derek's loyalty. Now I finally get what should have been mine all along. Derek's hands slammed down on the arms of his chair. "You planned this? You bought that shirt before Dad even died?" Brittany's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Derek, you don't understand. I was grieving too. I said things I didn't mean." "You were grieving?" I found my voice for the first time since the reading began, surprised by how steady it sounded. "You were planning my humiliation while my husband was dying." "But there's more," Mr. Hartman said grimly. Harold heard the rest of that conversation. My heart pounded as he continued reading. The person on the phone asked Brittany about the will, and she said she wasn't worried because she'd been working on Derek for years to see things her way. She said, "By the time the old man dies, Derek won't even care about dividing anything with his mother. I've made sure he sees her as a burden instead of a parent." The room felt like it was spinning. Derek was staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror and recognition that was slowly replacing the confusion. "She then said something that broke my heart completely," Harold's letter continued. "She told whoever was on the phone, 'The best part is that Derek actually believes I care about his mother. He thinks I'm just being practical when I exclude her from things. He has no idea I've been planning to cut her out of our lives entirely once Harold is gone.'" Derek stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "Is this true?" His voice was barely controlled. "Have you been planning to cut my mother out of our lives?" Brittany's mask was completely gone now. The charming daughter-in-law who'd fooled my son for 8 years had vanished, replaced by someone cold and calculating. "Derek, your father was sick. He might have misunderstood. Did you buy that shirt before my father died?" Derek's voice rose with each word. "Did you plan to humiliate my mother at his funeral?" When Brittany didn't answer, just stared at the floor, Derek turned to Mr. Hartman. "Is there more?" "Harold included one final paragraph," the lawyer said softly. "He wanted to explain his decisions about the will." "Derek, my son," Mr. Hartman read, "I know this is painful to hear, but I pray it will open your eyes before it's too late. Brittany didn't marry you because she loved you. She married you because she saw an opportunity to control someone kind and trusting. She's been systematically destroying your relationship with your mother because she knew Maria would eventually see through her act." Derek sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. Oh God, what have I done?" "The money I've left you is substantial enough to start over if you choose to leave this toxic marriage," Harold's words continued. "But it's separate from marital assets, because I suspect Brittany has already spent your future in her mind. The woman you married sees people as resources to be used, not loved ones to be cherished. I watched my son's world collapse as he realized how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. 8 years of gradually learning to see me through Brittany's eyes. 8 years of small betrayals that had led to this moment. As for Brittany, Mr. Tree, Hartman read the final lines. I leave her exactly what she deserves for the pain she has caused. $1 and the knowledge that her cruelty has been documented and exposed. I also leave her with this message. The greedy old hag you've spent years trying to destroy is the most generous, loving woman I've ever known. Your inability to see that says everything about your character and nothing about hers. The silence that followed felt eternal. Derek was crying now. Quiet tears of shame and recognition. Brittany sat frozen, perhaps finally understanding that her carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. There's a postscript, Mr. Hartman added gently. Harold wrote, Maria, my beloved wife, please don't let this poison the rest of your life. You are worth more than how they have treated you. You always have been. I felt something break open in my chest. Not the painful break of heartache, but the liberating break of a dam that had held back years of suppressed hurt and anger. Harold had seen everything. He had validated every moment I'd questioned myself, every time I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive, every instance when I'd felt invisible and unwelcome. Derek finally looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. But I wasn't ready for his apologies yet. I turned to look at Brittany, who was still sitting rigidly in her chair. That awful shirt stretched across her chest like a confession of guilt. Take it off, I said quietly. What? Brittany's voice was barely a whisper. The shirt. Take it off. Right now. Maria, Mr. Hartman started. Perhaps we should. No. I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in years. She wore it to hurt me, to celebrate what she thought was my defeat. She can take it off and face what she's really done. Derek looked between us, his face reflecting his internal struggle between his wife and his mother, between 8 years of manipulation and 42 years of unconditional love. Take it off, Brittany, he said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. Take off that horrible shirt and get out. Derek, please, Brittany's voice cracked. We can work through this. Your father was confused, maybe bitter about dying. Get out, Derek repeated, louder this time. Take off that shirt, get out of this office, and get out of my life. For the first time since I'd known her, Brittany had no response, no manipulation, no way to turn this situation to her advantage. She'd been exposed completely, and there was nowhere left to hide. But as she slowly pulled the shirt over her head, revealing a plain white tank top underneath, I realized this wasn't the end of the story Harold had set in motion. This was just the beginning of Brittany finally facing the consequences of 8 years of calculated cruelty. Brittany stood there in her white tank top, the offensive shirt balled up in her trembling hands, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. But I felt no pity. 8 years of systematic cruelty had taught me that Brittany's vulnerability was just another tool in her arsenal. I should go, she whispered, glancing toward the door. No, Derek said, his voice still heavy with shock and anger. Not yet. I need answers. Real answers. Not the lies you've been feeding me for 8 years. Mr. Hartman quietly gathered Harold's letter and the will documents, giving us space while remaining available if needed. I could see in his expression that he'd witnessed many family dramas in this office, but this one had shaken even him. Derek turned to face his wife fully. Did you really say those things about my mother? About planning to cut her out of our lives? Brittany's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape. Derek, you have to understand. I felt like I was competing with her for your attention. Every holiday, every birthday, every family decision had to include what Maria wanted, what Maria thought, what Maria needed. The audacity of it took my breath away. What I wanted, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. What I wanted was to see my son occasionally. What I wanted was to not be treated like a burden at family gatherings. What I wanted was for my grandson to know his grandmother, your grandson. Brittany's mask slipped further, revealing something ugly underneath. You mean the child you see maybe once a month because you can't be bothered to really be part of his life? Derek's head snapped toward his wife. What are you talking about? Mom asks about Tyler constantly. She's always wanting to spend more time with him. I meant, Brittany said, scrambling to recover. That she doesn't really understand modern parenting. She's from a different generation. Stop. Derek held up his hand. Just stop lying. Dad documented everything, Brittany. I'm starting to remember things differently now. Like Tyler's birthday party last year. I remembered that party. I'd been told it was just a small family celebration and had arrived to find 20 children and their parents. Brittany had introduced me to other parents as Derek's mother who doesn't get out much anymore, making me sound like a recluse rather than someone who'd simply been excluded from the planning. You told me Mom couldn't handle big crowds anymore, Derek continued, his voice gaining strength as memories returned. But she seemed fine at the party. Actually, she seemed hurt that she didn't know it was going to be so big. I was protecting her, Brittany said weakly. I thought. You were protecting yourself, I interrupted. You didn't want me involved in planning my own grandson's birthday party because you wanted all the credit for being the perfect mother and daughter-in-law. Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were clear for the first time in years. The Christmas presents, 2 years ago, when Tyler opened his gifts from Grandma, you said something about how electronic toys were more educational than old-fashioned books and puzzles. I had spent weeks choosing those books, classic stories I'd read to Derek as a child. Tyler had seemed excited about them until Brittany's comment made him set them aside in favor of the expensive gadgets she'd bought. You made my gifts seem inferior, I said quietly. You made Tyler think books weren't as good as tablets and video games. I wasn't. Brittany started, then stopped. Even she seemed to realize how hollow her denials sounded now. Derek stood up and walked to the window, his back to both of us. How many times did you do this? How many times did you manipulate situations to make Mom feel unwelcome? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Mr. Hartman discreetly checked his watch, clearly wondering how long this confrontation would continue in his office. There's something else, Derek said without turning around. Last month, when Mom offered to babysit Tyler so we could go to dinner for our anniversary. You said she'd mentioned feeling tired lately and might not be up for watching a 6-year-old all evening. My chest tightened. I had offered enthusiastically to watch Tyler, had been looking forward to an evening alone with my grandson. The rejection had stung, especially when Derek had seemed to accept Brittany's explanation so readily. I never said I was tired, I said. I specifically told you I'd love to spend the evening with Tyler. Brittany's face crumpled slightly. I just thought a hired babysitter would be more reliable than his grandmother. Derek's voice was dangerously quiet. The woman who raised me? Who never missed a school play or soccer game or parent-teacher conference. That was different, Brittany said desperately. You were her child. Tyler is. Is what? Derek spun around, his eyes blazing. Also her family? Also someone she loves? The room fell silent except for the sound of Brittany's increasingly labored breathing. She was finally cornered, finally forced to confront the reality of what she'd done without the safety net of Derek's blind trust. I need to ask you something directly, Derek said, moving closer to his wife. And I want the truth. Have you been deliberately keeping Mom away from Tyler? Brittany's composure finally shattered completely. Yes, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Yes, I have. But not because I'm cruel or manipulative. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. Afraid that Tyler would love you more than me, Brittany sobbed. Afraid that Derek would realize his mother was more nurturing, more patient, more everything than I could ever be. Afraid that if you spent too much time together, you'd both see how inadequate I really am. The admission hung in the air like smoke. This was the truth beneath 8 years of calculated cruelty. Not malice for malice's sake, but something perhaps worse. The destruction of relationships born from her own insecurity and jealousy. Derek stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. So, you decided to solve your insecurity by isolating my mother? By making her feel unwanted and unwelcome? By turning me against the woman who raised me? I didn't mean for it to go so far, Brittany whispered. It started small, just little comments here and there. But then Derek started agreeing with me, started seeing things my way. And I couldn't stop. The honesty was devastating in its selfishness. She'd poisoned an entire family dynamic to protect her own fragile ego, and she'd been successful for 8 years. "Where does this leave us?" Derek asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Brittany looked up at him hopefully. "We can fix this. I can apologize to Maria. We can start over. We can." "No," Derek said firmly. "We can't. Because I don't know who you really are anymore. The woman I married wouldn't have done these things. Either she never existed, or you've changed into someone I don't recognize." As I watched my son finally see his wife clearly, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Harold's letter had accomplished what he'd intended, but the cost was Derek's marriage and Tyler's family stability. Sometimes the truth set you free, but first it destroyed everything built on lies. 2 weeks after the reading of Harold's will, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, willing myself to make a call I'd been avoiding. Derek had contacted me 3 times since that devastating day in Mr. Hartman's office, each message more desperate than the last. But I wasn't ready to forgive yet, wasn't ready to pretend that 8 years of hurt could be erased by his newfound clarity about his wife. The house felt different without Harold. Not just empty, but somehow larger, as if his presence had been holding it together and now I was rattling around in too much space. I'd been married for 45 years, and suddenly I was learning how to be alone again. But alone felt better than invisible, which is how I'd felt for the past 8 years whenever Derek and Brittany were around. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the peephole, I saw Derek standing on my porch, looking haggard and older than his 42 years. He was alone. "Hi, Mom," he said when I opened the door. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside to let him in, noting how he paused in the entryway, looking around the house he'd grown up in as if seeing it for the first time, or maybe seeing it clearly for the first time in years. "You look tired," I said, leading him to the kitchen where I'd spent countless hours helping him with homework, listening to his teenage problems, celebrating his successes. "I haven't been sleeping much." Derek sat heavily in his old chair at the kitchen table. "Brittany moved out last week. She's staying with her sister in Portland." I poured coffee without asking if he wanted any. Some rituals were deeper than anger. "And Tyler? He's with me." Brittany said she needs time to find herself and figure out what she wants. Derek's voice cracked slightly. "She left her 6-year-old son so she could find herself." I set the coffee in front of him and sat across the table, studying my son's face. He looked broken, but there was something else there too, a clarity that had been missing for years. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you respond, okay?" I nodded, wrapping my hands around my own coffee mug. "I've been thinking about everything Dad wrote in that letter, trying to remember things from your perspective instead of through Brittany's filter, and I realized that what happened in that lawyer's office wasn't the beginning of the truth. It was just the first time I was forced to hear it." Derek stared into his coffee. "Do you remember 2 years ago when Tyler fell off his bike and scraped his knee really badly? You were at our house that day, and you immediately went to clean his wound and put a bandage on it." I did remember. Tyler had been crying, and my grandmother instincts had kicked in automatically. I'd cleaned the scrape gently, distracting him with stories while I applied antibiotic cream and a colorful bandage. "Brittany pulled me aside afterward and said she was concerned about you taking over with Tyler's injury. She said it might confuse him about who his primary caregiver was, that it was important for him to come to his parents first when he was hurt." The memory stung fresh. I'd thought I was being helpful, being a grandmother, but Derek had later mentioned casually that maybe I should check with them before jumping in with Tyler in the future. "I actually agreed with her," Derek continued, his voice heavy with shame. "I thought she was being a protective mother, setting healthy boundaries. But now I realize what really happened. Tyler had stopped crying immediately when you took care of him. He felt safe with you, comforted by you, and Brittany couldn't stand that." I felt tears prick my eyes, remembering how confused I'd been by Derek's gentle correction, how I'd second-guessed every interaction with Tyler afterward. "There's more," Derek said. "Last Christmas, when you gave Tyler those books and Brittany made that comment about electronic toys being more educational, I found those books yesterday when I was cleaning out a closet. They were hidden in the back, never even unwrapped properly. Brittany had convinced Tyler to put them away for later, and then made sure later never came. My throat tightened. Those books had been carefully chosen, stories that had sparked Derek's own love of reading as a child. I'd imagined reading them with Tyler, sharing that special bond between grandmother and grandson. But the worst thing, Derek continued, was Tyler's reaction when I told him Brittany had moved out. You know what he asked me? I shook my head, not trusting my voice. He asked if this meant Grandma Maria could come over more often. A 6-year-old child was already aware that his mother was keeping his grandmother away from him. The words hit me like a physical blow. Tyler had noticed. Even at his young age, he'd understood that something was wrong with how infrequently he saw me. Derek, I said carefully, why are you telling me this now? He looked up at me with eyes that reminded me of the little boy he'd once been, the one who used to crawl into my lap when he'd made a mistake and needed forgiveness. Because I need you to know that I remember who you really are now. I need you to know that I understand what I allowed to happen to you, to us, and I need to ask if there's any way you can forgive me. The question hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and comfort him the way I had when he was small, but another part of me, the part that had been wounded and dismissed for 8 years, wasn't ready to make it that easy. Derek, do you remember what you said to me at Tyler's 4th birthday party when I suggested we play some of the games I used to organize for your birthday parties? He winced. I said those games were probably too old-fashioned for Tyler's friends. You said they were boring, and that kids today needed more stimulation than simple party games could provide. In front of all the other parents, you made me sound like an out-of-touch old woman who didn't understand children. Derek's face crumpled. I was just repeating what Brittany had told me. She said that kind of structured play was outdated, that it might make Tyler feel different from his friends. But you didn't think to ask me what I thought. You didn't consider that I'd successfully raised you and might have some insight into what children enjoy. You just accepted her judgment over mine. You're right, Derek whispered. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for every time I chose her opinion over your feelings. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel unwelcome in your own family. The apology I'd waited 8 years to hear should have felt more satisfying. Instead, it just felt heavy with the weight of all the lost time, all the moments with Tyler I'd missed, all the ways Derek and I had grown apart. I want to forgive you, I said honestly, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about Brittany manipulating you. At some point you chose to see me the way she wanted you to see me. You chose to value her comfort over my feelings repeatedly. Derek nodded miserably. I know. I kept telling myself I was just trying to keep the peace, trying to make everyone happy, but really, I was taking the easy path. It was easier to go along with Brittany's version of things than to stand up for you and risk conflict in my marriage. The honesty was brutal, but necessary. For too long, Derek had been able to hide behind the excuse of being manipulated, but manipulation only worked when there was something in the victim that was willing to be manipulated. What happens now? I asked. I don't know, Derek admitted. Brittany wants me to go to counseling with her to try to save our marriage. She says she's realized how wrong she was and wants to make amends. And what do you want? Derek was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the garden Harold and I had planted together 30 years ago. I want Tyler to grow up knowing his grandmother. I want him to hear stories about his grandfather and understand where he comes from. I want him to feel unconditionally loved by his family, not like love is something he has to earn or compete for. That doesn't answer my question about what you want regarding Brittany, he sighed heavily. I don't know if I can trust her anymore. Even if she's genuinely sorry, even if she really wants to change, how do I know she won't fall back into the same patterns when things get stressful? How do I know she won't start resenting you again the first time Tyler chooses to confide in you instead of her? These were good questions. Hard questions that didn't have easy answers. The fact that Derek was asking them suggested that Harold's letter had accomplished more than just exposing Brittany's behavior. It had forced Derek to examine his own choices and priorities. There's something else, Derek said. I called Dad's lawyer yesterday. I want to set up a trust fund for Tyler with part of the money Dad left me. But I want you to be the trustee, not Brittany. I want you to have a say in decisions about Tyler's future. The gesture was significant, I knew. It represented Derek choosing to trust me over his wife, choosing to ensure I had a permanent role in Tyler's life regardless of what happened with his marriage. "I'd be honored," I said simply. "And Mom, I want Tyler to spend this weekend with you, just the two of you. No interference, no supervision, no rules about what you can or can't do together. I want him to get to know his grandmother the way I got to know mine." For the first time since Harold's death, I felt a genuine smile cross my face. "I'd love that." Derek reached across the table and took my hand. "I know I can't undo 8 years of mistakes. I know trust has to be rebuilt slowly. But I promise you, whatever happens with my marriage, you will never be pushed out of our lives again." As I looked at my son, I saw echoes of the man Harold and I had raised, the one who'd been temporarily lost but not permanently damaged. The road back wouldn't be easy, and there would be more difficult conversations ahead. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back. The doorbell rang again, and Derek tensed. "I'm not expecting anyone." Through the window, I could see a familiar figure on the porch. Brittany stood there with a suitcase, her face streaked with tears, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd worn that horrible shirt just 2 weeks ago. Derek saw her too, and stood up slowly. "She said she wasn't coming back until she'd figured things out." "Maybe she has," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. As Derek walked toward the front door, I remained in the kitchen, listening to the murmur of voices. This wasn't my conversation to join, but whatever happened next would affect Tyler, would affect my relationship with my son, would affect the fragile healing that had just begun between us. I thought about Harold's letter, about his hope that the truth would set us all free. But freedom, I was learning, was more complicated than simply exposing lies. Sometimes it required choosing between forgiveness and self-protection, between second chances and hard-learned boundaries. Whatever Derek decided about his marriage, I would support him. But I would never again allow myself to become invisible in my own family's life. Harold's letter had given me back my voice, and I intended to use it. I listened from the kitchen as Derek opened the front door. The conversation that followed was muffled, but I could hear the desperation in Brittany's voice, the measured caution in Derek's responses. After 10 minutes, I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen. Derek appeared in the doorway alone. "She wants to talk to both of us, together. She says she has something important to say." "I don't think I'm ready for that," I said honestly. I told her that might be the case. "But Mom, she looks different. Broken, maybe." I think what happened in that lawyer's office really shook her. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of the old Derek, the one who'd been so easily swayed by Brittany's manipulations. But his expression was clear, alert, protective even. "If you're not comfortable, I'll tell her to leave," he said. "Your peace of mind matters more than her need to apologize." The fact that he said that he put my feelings first without hesitation, told me more about his transformation than any words could have. This was the son I'd raised, the one who'd been temporarily lost but was finding his way back. 5 minutes, I said. "She gets 5 minutes, and then she leaves." Derek nodded and returned to the front door. When he came back, Brittany followed behind him, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the confident woman who'd worn that offensive shirt to Harold's funeral. This version of Brittany had hollow eyes and trembling hands. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same spot where Derek and I had shared countless conversations over the years. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was now sitting in the place reserved for family. "Maria," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know you have every right to hate me. I know what I did was unforgivable." I remained silent. I'd learned over the years that silence often revealed more truth than questions. "These past 2 weeks have been the worst of my life," Brittany continued. "Not because Derek asked me to leave, not because I had to face what I'd done, but because I finally understood what I'd become." She looked down at her hands, which were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "I went to see a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen. Derek probably told you I said I needed to find myself. But what I really needed was to understand how I became someone capable of such cruelty." Derek shifted beside her, but his expression remained guarded. He was listening, but I could see he wasn't ready to trust yet. "Dr. Chen helped me realize that everything I did to you came from my own insecurities and childhood trauma. My mother was very critical, always comparing me to other people, never satisfied with anything I accomplished. When I married Derek, I thought I'd finally found a family where I could be valued. I wanted to point out that she had been valued, that Derek and I had both welcomed her warmly in the beginning. But I'd promised her 5 minutes, and I was curious to see where this was leading. But then I started noticing how much Derek loved and respected you, how he called you for advice, how he lit up when he talked about his childhood, how Tyler naturally gravitated toward you when you were around. Instead of seeing that as something beautiful to be part of, I saw it as competition. Brittany's voice cracked, and genuine tears began flowing down her cheeks. I convinced myself that there wasn't enough love to go around, that if Derek and Tyler loved you, there would be less love available for me. So I started trying to diminish your role in their lives. Started trying? I said quietly. You succeeded. For 8 years. I know, she whispered. I know I did. And the worst part is that the more successful I was at pushing you away, the more I had to keep going. Because if Derek ever realized what I'd done, if he ever saw how I'd manipulated him, he'd hate me. Derek spoke for the first time since sitting down. I do hate what you did, Brittany. I hate that I was so blind to it. I hate that I let you turn me against my own mother. But do you hate me? She asked, looking at him with desperate hope. Derek was quiet for a long moment. I don't know yet. I'm angry. I'm disappointed. I'm questioning everything about our marriage. But hate? I'm not sure I'm capable of hating the mother of my child. It was a careful answer, honest but not encouraging. The Derek I'd raised had always been thoughtful about important decisions, and I was glad to see that trait hadn't been completely eroded. I want to make this right, Brittany said, turning back to me. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to repair some of the damage. How? I asked simply. Brittany reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I wrote down everything I could remember, every lie I told Derek about you, every event I manipulated, every time I deliberately excluded you or made you feel unwelcome. I thought if I was completely honest about the scope of what I'd done, maybe we could start to address it. She slid the envelope across the table to me. I also wrote letters to Tyler, age-appropriate ones that Derek can give him when he's older, explaining that the distance between you two was my fault, not yours. I don't want him to grow up thinking his grandmother didn't want to be part of his life. The gesture was thoughtful, but I found myself wondering if it was genuine remorse or another manipulation. 8 years of calculated cruelty weren't easily forgotten. There's more, Brittany continued. I've been in contact with Dr. Chen about family therapy. Not couples counseling to save my marriage, but family therapy to address the damage I've caused to your relationship with Derek and Tyler. I want to participate in that healing process, even if it means facing more uncomfortable truths about myself. Derek looked surprised. You want to do therapy with my mother? I want to do whatever it takes to undo the poison I've spread in this family, Brittany said firmly. Even if Derek decides he can't forgive me, even if our marriage is over, I don't want my actions to continue hurting Maria or Tyler. For the first time since she'd arrived, I detected something that felt genuine in her voice. Not the practiced manipulation I'd grown accustomed to, but real remorse mixed with determination. Why should I believe this isn't just another performance? I asked bluntly. Brittany met my eyes directly for the first time. Because I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for a second chance. I'm not asking for anything except the opportunity to try to repair some of the damage I've caused. Whether you ever trust me again, whether Derek takes me back, whether Tyler ever sees me as anything more than the person who kept him from his grandmother, none of that is your responsibility. She stood up slowly. I know my 5 minutes are up. I just want you to know that your husband's letter saved this family, even if it destroyed my place in it. Harold saw what was happening and found a way to protect you from me. I hope someday you can see that as the act of love it was, not just as the exposure of my cruelty. As Brittany moved toward the kitchen door, she paused and looked back at Derek. I'll be staying at my sister's for the foreseeable future. When you're ready to discuss custody arrangements for Tyler, or if you decide you want to try therapy, you know how to reach me. But I won't pressure you for an answer. After she left, Derek and I sat in silence for several minutes. The envelope she'd left lay unopened between us, representing either genuine accountability or an elaborate manipulation. I wasn't sure which. What do you think? Derek asked finally. I think, I said carefully, that time will tell whether this is real change or just a more sophisticated version of the same manipulation. Derek nodded. Part of me wants to believe her, the part that remembers falling in love with her, that wants Tyler to grow up with both parents. But another part of me wonders if I'll ever be able to trust my own judgment when it comes to her. I reached across the table and took his hand. You don't have to decide anything today, or this week, or even this month. The most important thing is that you and Tyler are both safe and healthy. What about you, Mom? Are you willing to consider the family therapy she mentioned? I thought about it honestly. The idea of sitting in a room with Brittany, rehashing 8 years of hurt and manipulation, felt exhausting. But the idea of Tyler growing up in a family fractured by secrets and resentment felt worse. If Dr. Chen thinks it would be helpful, and if you think it's what's best for Tyler, then yes, I'll try it. Derek squeezed my hand. Thank you. For being willing to try, for not giving up on us, for still being here despite everything. 3 months later, I was in my garden, planting the spring bulbs Harold and I had always planted together, when I heard a familiar voice call out, "Grandma Maria!" Tyler came running across the yard, his face bright with excitement. At 6 years old, he was all energy and curiosity, and over the past months, I'd been rediscovering the joy of seeing the world through his eyes. "Look what I made for you at school." He thrust a handmade Mother's Day card toward me, construction paper decorated with glitter and crooked letters that spelled out, "Best Grandma Ever." Derek followed behind more slowly, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. "We thought we'd see if you wanted to come to Tyler's baseball game this afternoon. He's been practicing the batting stance you taught him." "I'd love to," I said, accepting Tyler's enthusiastic hug and getting glitter all over my gardening clothes. As Tyler ran off to explore the garden, Derek sat beside me on the old wooden bench Harold had built years ago. "How are you doing, Mom?" "Really? Better," I said honestly. "Some days are harder than others. Missing your father, but having Tyler in my life again, rebuilding our relationship, it's been healing." Derek nodded. "Dr. Chen says that's normal. Grief and healing often happen simultaneously." The family therapy sessions had been difficult but productive. Brittany had been true to her word, participating fully and honestly in the process of examining and addressing the damage she'd caused. She was living separately, seeing Tyler regularly but under a custody arrangement that prioritized his stability and my involvement in his life. Derek and Brittany were still deciding whether their marriage could be salvaged, but they were doing so with professional guidance and a commitment to Tyler's well-being above their own desires. It wasn't the fairy tale ending some might have hoped for, but it was honest and healthy in a way their relationship had never been before. "Mom," Derek said quietly, "I've been thinking about something Dad wrote in his letter, about hoping I might remember the man you and he raised me to be." "You are that man," I said. "You were just lost for a while. I want to make sure Tyler never gets lost like I did. I want him to grow up knowing that family means loyalty and honesty and unconditional love, not manipulation and competition." "He will," I assured him. "We'll make sure of it." As Tyler ran back toward us, clutching a handful of dandelions he'd picked as a bouquet for me, I thought about Harold's letter and how it had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately saved our family. The truth had been painful. The healing was ongoing and the future was still uncertain. But for the first time in 8 years, I felt like I belonged in my own family again. Tyler handed me the dandelions with a gap-toothed grin. "These are for you, Grandma. Dad says dandelions are weeds, but I think they're pretty." "They're beautiful," I said, meaning it. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones other people don't appreciate properly. As I looked at my grandson, then at my son, I realized that Harold's final gift hadn't just been exposing the truth about Brittany. It had been reminding all of us what family was supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not without challenges, but rooted in genuine love and respect. The woman who had once worn a shirt calling me a greedy old hag was working to repair the damage she'd caused. My son was learning to be the man his father and I had raised him to be, and I was no longer invisible in my own family's story. It was, I thought, as Tyler chattered about his upcoming baseball game, exactly the kind of ending Harold would have wanted. Not revenge, not punishment, but healing. Not perfection, but truth. Not a fairy tale, but something better. A real family, finally finding their way back to each other.